Hello and welcome back to the last series on post-colonial masculine gender studies with Dr. Rob Stegmann. My name is Elijah Kay, and in the first series we dealt with some definitions on colonialism and post-colonialism, and then we looked at the history of colonialism in South Africa before talking about the US a little bit. In the second series, we looked more at the biblical world. We looked at Roman imperial colonization. We looked at Paul and the churches as being colonized by the Roman powers. And then we talked a little bit about what is the Bible. In this series, we hope to dive in a little more deeply and look at Paul as a body person and the churches as people who have bodies. That's not something that's talked about often, but Rob Stegmann thought it would be very important to talk about, so that's going to be what we start off with in this series. And then after we do that, we're going to talk about the church and masculinity and gender today. So we're going to talk about the church in our society and the church in South Africa. And we're going to talk about our understandings and society's understandings of masculinity and gender. And then finally, we're going to finish off by talking a little bit about the white male response and the responses of the President of the United States in our current context. So I hope you find this very interesting. Again, it's hard to cover all this stuff in a short amount of time and with only a few videos. So we're doing the best we can, but if you think we missed anything or if you think that there's something that we need to talk more about, please feel free to comment. I know this is going on a blog and also on YouTube, so feel free to leave comments in the comments sections below both of those things. All right, so enough of me, and let's get to talking to Rob. So in your upcoming book, you discuss bodies as telling a story. Often bodies become co-opted by an empire, society, or culture in order to support a narrative. We talked about this some previously, where masculinity was regarded as the highest depiction of humanity, and where conquered nations and peoples were often depicted as feminine in comparison to the mighty colonizers. In your book, you write, gender becomes just one more way in which the bodies of women and men become the social and political sites for regulating and disciplining social norms and conventions, and for reinscribing the deeply entrenched hierarchy of the Greek and Roman worlds. The physical body, however it is represented, is a symbol of the social body, the body politic. So I know that we talked about Paul and his co-authors and his listeners some last series, but let's focus on Paul as an embodied soul, or as one of my Jewish teachers at Fuller says, an ensouled body. What is significant about the body of Paul as a colonized Jewish male, yet highly intelligent apostle / former Pharisee? And what is significant about the bodies of his audiences and what Paul does in his writings to them?
Yeah, I think it's an important question for us to wrestle with, because I think we sometimes forget that someone like Paul, or even any one of the other writers of the New Testament, actually were bodied people. And as bodied people, that bodliness actually plays out in what they're doing as authors, right? So what I try to explore there is what it would look like, or what it would mean for us to stop for a moment to think about Paul as actually having a body, and to ask ourselves, well, what kind of body would he have had? Not in the physical descriptive sense, but to simply foreground the fact that Paul was a bodied male writing these letters to these communities. These communities were made up of people who had bodies. And I also wanted to play around with the idea that when we look at bodies, and we look at the bodies of texts, like Paul's letters, which is a body of texts, I wanted to wrestle with the relationship between those bodied texts and the bodies that they're actually inscribing or regulating or shaping. And so I think it's an important thing for us to reflect on. So if Paul is a Jew, he's a male, he's a conquered Jew in a first century context, what difference does that actually make to how he sees himself how he represents himself within the context of the letter that he's writing, and what that ultimately means in relation to his audience, who are also bodied individuals. And I think in one of our earlier sessions, we also spoke about the fact that when Paul's writing to the Thessalonians, it's very likely that he's addressing himself primarily to a male audience, not exclusively. So it's not to the exclusion of women being present in the household church, but it is to acknowledge the fact that in the way in which Paul addresses himself to this community, addresses himself to the adelphoi, to the brothers. So it's male to male. And that, I think, has to be foregrounded. It has to be brought to the surface, so that we can deal with what's sometimes missing from our engagement with the text. So really, I think part of what we're doing there is just saying Paul has a body, he's a conquered Jew. Well, as a conquered Jew, does that actually shift our understanding of what he's doing in relation to the audience that he's addressing himself to? I don't know if that kind of helps to explain what's going on there, and maybe we could chat a little bit more, take the idea a bit further if you want.
When I read a lot of what Paul is saying, I see passages where Paul is obviously breaking down traditional norms, but I'm also seeing points where he upholds this Roman uber masculine patriarchal hierarchy. And I always want to wonder why, as an oppressed Jew himself, as one who has been emasculated or feminized as a conquered people, why would he even use this mold, this hierarchy when discussing things in his letter?
Yeah. I think what we need to remind ourselves of is that in the context of colonization, and this is exactly the value of post-colonial biblical criticism, is that it enables us to appreciate the complexity of the relationship between the colonizer and the colonized. And that relationship is not nearly as straightforward as we'd want it to be, right? So the point of departure here is that we need to acknowledge that whilst Paul is a colonized Jew, living in the context of the empire, he is being shaped by that context and molded into thinking along the lines of the imperial ideology, in as much as any other cultural influence would have had an impact on his thinking, right? Because he doesn't exist in a vacuum. But as a colonized individual, Paul is also wanting to demonstrate resistance against that normative narrative of the empire. And I think the thing that we have to entertain here is that ultimately Paul's identity is what we would describe as a hybrid identity. He is able to embody in himself and in his thinking both a colonizing way of thinking and a resistance to that way of thinking. And I think there's evidence enough to support the fact that Paul's understanding of the gospel itself represents a movement in the direction of resistance. And yet at the same time, he employs the language of the empire. And when you employ the language of the empire, you always run the risk of reinscribing the norms and the conventions of the empire. And I think it's for that reason that when we're reading through his letters, we have these moments, these very clear moments, where the resistance is absolutely unquestionable, that he is moving in a direction that is countercultural, counterpolitical, and it is ultimately setting up a counterpolis. But the very act of setting up that countercultural community in the form of the church, this ecclesia, he's also using the tools of the empire to do that. So in Philippians chapter 3, verse 20, where he talks about the Philippian community having their citizenship in heaven, he's using the language of the empire, and he's saying, your citizenship is not here on earth under the Roman Empire. Your citizenship is actually in heaven, but it's nonetheless a citizenship, right? It's this notion of the Philippian community seeing themselves as a colonial outpost of heaven on earth, right? And I think that's always the challenge with the way that the language works, and it's always a reminder that at the end of the day, we're dealing with hybrid identities, a mix of both and I think that makes for a very complex and very thickly layered understanding of what we're dealing with when we're actually working through Paul's letters.
So in Kwok Pui Lan's work, Post-Colonial Imagination, and I believe it is in her work, if I remember correctly, Kwok Pui Lan says that a lot of times colonized cultures can almost have this sort of backlash, pendulum swing reaction to colonialism, where if they were patriarchal, or even if they were matriarchal societies, they can become like uber patriarchal as the culture run by men seeks to reestablish traditional norms. Does that sound correct?
Yeah, definitely. I mean,
So
I think.
oh yeah, I'm sorry.
Yeah, go.
Is there any possibility that any of this could be happening with Paul in his writings, where there is some of this? I think Kwok Pui Lan even says that some of the Jewish males felt that their masculinity and their role in the family was hindered by the Roman Empire. So is there a possibility that males like Paul are trying to reclaim some of that masculinity, reclaim some of that pride in being a male, and that's coming out here?
I think that's always a possibility. I think again, if we understand colonial contexts or contexts of empire, we have to do work with the reality that identity is very complex, and that in many instances we have examples where, in response to a colonial or imperial culture, those who are colonized end up almost pushing the pendulum even further in the direction of colonial thinking, and embody in the way that they hold themselves, conduct themselves, in the values that they espouse, the very things that in many ways they would want to resist. So I think there is a real possibility that Paul sometimes comes across, maybe more than just sometimes, that he comes across in many ways as over, as you described, like an uber masculine, right? So kind of hyper masculinity begins to reveal itself in the way that Paul is setting things up, or even, to be really honest, the kind of patriarchy, a hyper patriarchy that plays itself out in the way that he constructs the identity of the community, or the structure of the community, the church. A good example of this actually is Ephesians chapter 5. So we're familiar with Ephesians chapter 5. It's a passage that's often used in the context of weddings, problematically. But chapter 5 in Ephesians gives us essentially the household code for what Paul envisions through the lens of Christ, the structure and order of the household, the family, but also the household of God, right? And I think what's interesting about that Ephesians chapter 5 passage is that it can be read in a variety of different ways. I think it's definitely often read in a way that reinforces patriarchy. But I think we also need to understand that it is an attempt on the part of Paul in relation to this particular community to set the community up in such a way as to no longer draw the wrong kind of attention from the outside culture. Like, I think we need to remind ourselves that these fledgling communities which Paul had started, there was a lot of work that needed to be done to establish themselves, and part of that establishing often required them to stay under the radar, so to speak. So there is a view of reading Ephesians chapter 5 as an attempt on the part of the community and certainly on the part of Paul to establish that community as not being against the dominant culture, and yet at the same time also embodying a very clear departure in the way that household would have been structured, acknowledgement that both male and female husbands and wives needed to submit to Christ, who is the head of the church. And that represents a departure, possibly not as far as, again, as we were saying, as far as we would have wanted Paul to go. But again, there are so many different angles on these texts, and we need to just remind ourselves that it's never as straightforward as we want it to be. And it's precisely because it's not as straightforward that we need to be careful about how we interpret these texts as now somehow becoming normative, or the kind of benchmark against which we're trying to measure contemporary Christian culture.
And I agree with that. I mean, there's part of me that looks at Romans 13 and Ephesians and thinks that if you're writing a letter to Rome or a Roman colony, it probably, and a new movement starting, it's what N.T. Wright says. You don't want the new movement to get crushed by the Romans so quickly.
Exactly.
So it would be best that if you want it to last for a little while, not to push all the buttons. Especially the buttons that are disobey Caesar when possible, forget the Roman ideology, do your own thing. So
but it's exactly why interpretation is so important, because when we don't pay attention to what's actually going on in the text, then we too easily assume that it's a straightforward matter, and we just simply need to do as the text says we should be doing, without recognizing that the text is actually trying to do something in a very, very particular context. And that, in some ways, the argument that we'd want to advance here is that we need to do what the New Testament writers were doing, which is not trying to simply perpetuate an idea, but they were trying to reflect on the ground, in the moment, in the very real, concrete setting of the communities to which they were addressing themselves, and they were trying to make sense of the meaning of Christ's death and resurrection in that moment. So the task of the church in the 21st century is to reflect on the implications of Jesus' death and resurrection in the 21st century, not assume that the first century context is universal and applicable across time, for all time. And I think that's exactly why the interpretive exercise does need to pay attention to the first century context and understand what is actually going on and why Paul does what he does in those particular contexts, but then also recognize we're not in that context. We're in a very different setting.